Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is weld. And this is another verb suggested by the viewer Luis. Luis, thank you so much for sharing another great idea with us. Now, let's take a moment and review some of the definitions or the ways that we use this verb. The first way you might encounter the verb weld means to join together metal pieces or parts or could be other materials by heating the surfaces to the point where they are melting. Now, with most uses of this verb, I would say the intent is with metal. As I was looking for some examples of this, I did see a few mentioning that we could technically weld plastics together, a little less common. But I've got a little picture down in the bottom right-hand corner of my screen to maybe help have a bit of a mental image as to what we're discussing here. So you can see this person is wearing a tremendous amount of protective gear. And again, it's because the way these surfaces are being heated, right? It's so hot. There's a risk of injury to various parts of one's body. So requires a lot of precaution. Now, a second way you might encounter the verb weld can mean to cause to combine and form either a harmonious whole or maybe a more effective whole. So, this second definition isn't really something we can watch happen like we can with the first definition. But we might think of kind of groups coming together, maybe to work really well together. That's a good way to think of that one. For now, you should know that weld is a regular verb. If you want to make the progressive form of this verb, all you need to do is add ing. That forms welding. The past tense and the participle forms of this verb can be made by just adding ed. Now, our base verb weld ends with a d sound. And this means when I add the ed ending, I'm going to add an extra syllable because this ed is going to make an id sound. So the past tense and the participle forms of the verb should sound like this: welded, welded. Now, there is one phrasal verb you might encounter, and that is to weld together. This can have a couple different meanings, so we'll look at a few examples with it as well. The first way to use it goes back to our first definition, right? We're fusing or combining two or more metal objects together through the application of heat or the use of an extremely hot temperature. An example of this in a sentence might be, we'll weld together these parts to form a trellis, right? So kind of a decorative uh, uh, kind of garden object that some people use so that flowers and vines can kind of grow on it and look attractive. Now, a second way you'll encounter weld together use can mean to cause two or more things to become unified or to have them exist together. An example of this: we must weld together these independent regions into a single country. Now, I think statements such as this or beliefs such as this have been used a number of times in history. It generally has not gone well. Um, kind of these false lines or false country borders through colonization had a lot of detrimental effects to be I, I really it's so severely bad. But anyway, we'll save that for someone else who's more of a history expert than I am. But again, you can kind of imagine, right, bringing together two independent regions. Now, a third way you might encounter weld together can mean to form an extremely strong bond between two or more people. This is a little more similar to that second definition of the verb weld that we discussed moments ago. An example of this: they've been welded together after being trapped in the cave for a week. So maybe you've heard stories like this where individuals are in danger in a particular confined area. They're together for an extended period of time, and sometimes something rather traumatic can force people to form very strong relationships where they stay in touch with one another because of just kind of how powerfully uh, severe that experience was. So that's what that sentence is describing there. Now let's move on and do a little verb tense practice with our verb weld. Today we're going to review the present progressive and the present perfect progressive. Let's start with the present progressive. Many teachers and textbooks will also call this the present continuous, and I always like to point out that's just fine. It means exactly the same thing. In either the present progressive or present continuous, we're talking about actions that are happening now or actions that are in progress during a period of time that has not been completed. The reason I like saying present progressive with my students is two-letter P's can help people remember they need two parts to make their verb. So what we'll be doing here is using a present form of be and then using the ing form of the verb. Now, the verb be in the present tense has three forms. So this means I must pay attention to my subject. If my subject is I'll use am and then that ing verb. If my subject is you, we, or they, I'll use are, A-R-E, and then the ing form of the verb. And finally, if my subject is he, she, or it, I'll use is and then the ing form of the verb. Let's take a look at my affirmative example. Students in the course are welding pipes together this week. Right? So this week is a time period that has not been completed yet, right? So that's an example of why it's appropriate to use the present progressive here. Now, if you want to make a negative sentence in the present progressive, what you want to do is insert not after that be verb. So again, you're still paying attention to your subject. You'll have the form of be that matches, then not, and then that ing form the verb. Here's another example. He isn't welding the repair site immediately, so he's going to cover the joint in paper to prevent dirt and grit from settling into the weld area. Okay, rather long description here, but hopefully you can see, right, the action is not happening now. Finally, let's look at making a yes or no question in the present progressive. To do this, start with your form of be, whatever form matches your subject. That subject comes next. Then use the ing form of the verb. Here's our last present progressive example. Is she welding or working on other mechanics projects now? Right? So asking what someone is doing right now. Now let's move on to the present perfect progressive. And again, some teachers, textbooks, and other YouTube videos will call this the present perfect continuous, and that is just fine. It means exactly the same thing. In this verb tense, we're talking about an action that started in the past and continues into the present. And generally, the reason we're choosing to use this verb tense is to really focus on how long the action has been continuing. Now you'll notice three P's in the name of this verb tense, present perfect progressive. That means you need three parts to make your verb. This is another verb tense where we need to pay attention to our subject. If our subject is I, you, we, or they, use have, then the participle been, B-E-E-N, and then the ing form of the verb. But if your subject is he, she, or it, use has been and the ing form of the verb. Let's take a look at the affirmative example. Students have been welding various objects over the course of the semester. Right? Started in the past, is still continuing in this particular class. Now, if you want to make a negative present perfect progressive sentence, again, pay attention to your subject, then you'll use have or has, whichever form matches that subject. Then use not, then the participle been, and then the ing form the verb. Here's another example. She hasn't been welding together the parts until she was certain that they would be utilized. So here's an action that hasn't started or hasn't been continuing. Now, let's look at that yes or no question in the present perfect progressive. To do this, start with have or has, whichever form matches the subject. That subject comes next, then the participle been, and then the ing form the verb. Here's our last example. Have soldiers been welding cages on their tanks as another protective measure? Right? And unfortunately, this, I believe, has been true in various conflicts as weapons have become more sophisticated. Many times people, soldiers, I feel like they need to take other precautions or additional precautions to keep themselves safe. So now let's spend a moment looking at some words that are related to our verb weld. And the first word we're going to look at is the noun form of this word. The noun weld has the exact same spelling and the exact same pronunciation as our verb. When this word gets used as a noun, we're talking about a welded joint. So generally, this is going to be metal that has been treated with that extreme heat, extreme temperatures in order to make it melt and join together. An example of this in a sentence. The Department of Justice was notified of suspected faulty welds on submarines and aircraft carriers. Okay, so very serious situation, not a good thing. That it's essentially suggesting we've had poor work done on these particular submarines and large ships that can hold airplanes and other aircraft. Another word you might encounter is the noun welder. That ER suffix tells us this is a person who welds metal most commonly, particularly as a profession. An example of this. The factory employs 20 full-time welders. So, can be a job that's in demand, at least here in the United States. I believe we are usually in the need of more skilled professionals to do this kind of work. Another word you might encounter is the adjective weldable. That able suffix is generally used with adjectives. It's telling us that something is able to or capable of being welded. And particularly what it means is we can combine or join these things together without introducing defects, or this thing is going to be able to perform in the way that it is intended. So most people would say, well, anything could be joined together, but will it work? So here, yes, that's the idea behind the adjective here. So an example of this, these weldable headlight tabs will be attractive to various car enthusiasts. So here we're describing something, again, that could be joined to other parts of vehicles. Thanks again to Luis for suggesting today's verb, and I thank you all for watching. Have a great day.